I'd like to call this meeting to order at 6:30 PM. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, adoption of the agenda. Can I get a mover and a seconder to adopt the agenda? Mover, Councillor D'Angela, seconder, Councillor Sentence. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Presentations. I'll call on our CAO, Manoj Dalwaria, to provide a brief overview and introduction to the presentation and our presenters today. Go ahead, Manoj.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. As directed by Council, the organization review was conducted for the city. If you recall that at June 20th Council meeting, Deloitte was retained to undertake this review. So tonight we have Sarah Baines, we have Tony Hammer, and Sumit Dave from Deloitte, who are going to do the presentation. After the presentation, feel free to ask any question that you may have. Following the presentation, an information report CEO 14-2023 will be tabled. So tonight, Council is going to receive the presentation, and subsequent to that, a staff report. At this point in time, I would invite Deloitte team to do the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can we, got the slides?
Is your speaker on?
I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe you want to, yeah, that's better.
Okay, thank you. If you wouldn't mind turning to the next slide, please. So we have 4 or 5 background slides that we're going to deliver before we get into the details. So this first slide really just talks to the background to the review, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but we'll refresh your memories for a moment or two first. So you'll be well aware that that Thorold has undergone spectacular growth over the last several years, and that that often places demand on staff. Staff has grown to a degree, and you'll see how much more we think it may need to grow in the subsequent slides. So what you were really looking for from the review was to understand how well you're structured and whether that should change, and whether you have too many or too few people given the growth curve that you've had, and to prepare yourselves for the future. So you commissioned the organisational review and the staffing analysis that comes with that. And so the idea here, the objectives on the right-hand side of this slide, was that where we could, we would evaluate the current service levels that you provide, either externally to your residents or internally to your own people from your internal services. We'd look at any service level gaps, again, where we could establish them, look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats as they relate to the services. Then we'd use a combination of interviews and benchmarking and review of documentation to understand the appropriateness of the current staffing resources and whether they should increase or potentially decrease. We'd also give some thoughts and views on recommendations to drive efficiency or productivity. That could be through the setting of service standards, for example, or the application of IT in certain aspects to reduce and automate work. And the idea was that in the end, we'd produce a staffing optimization plan, which would talk to sort of short-term, medium-term and longer-term modifications to staffing based on changes that we've either seen or we expect to see. So that's the background to and objectives of the review. Next slide, please. This is the engagement team. So Sarah led the work, and we'll introduce ourselves in a little more detail in a few moments. But so the senior leadership team on this has essentially been myself and Sarah, with some input from Shelley, who's not here tonight. Sumit's the person in the middle that gets everything done and organises the team and arranges the meetings and organises the outcomes and the outputs from our direction. And there are some specialists at the bottom where we've needed to deploy some of them on either on organisational structure analysis around the human capital piece, service profiling, and an opportunity identification with Dorian. Next slide, please. So just so that you understand, I've been with Deloitte for 5 years as a partner. I'm kind of proud and sad to report that I have 36 years of work experience in total, which is kind of nice and kind of like scary. 20 years of that as a management consultant. I've worked in the public sector in the UK, Canada, and in the Middle East, in central, regional, and local government, and municipalities considerably here. My specialisms are really in improving efficiency and effectiveness by transforming cost structures, implementing lean, and those kinds of aspects. And it says 9 here, but I've worked with many more than that over the years, including Niagara-on-the-Lake, recently Waterloo, Toronto, amongst others. And Sarah, whether you want to just say a few words yourself?
Excellent, thank you, Tony. So Sarah Ban, I'm a CPA by trade. I've been with Deloitte now for 13 years and a partner within our advisory practice focused on public sector. I, as well, along with Tony, have been serving a number of municipalities going through similar types of reviews, really focused on service delivery. How are you doing things for your citizens, but how are you supporting that with your resources appropriately? And so with a little bit more of a focus on the back office. Our third individual we have on the slide here is Dorian Wenzura. He is a subcontractor that we have used numerous times and feel that he brings great insights and value to these types of projects, given his hands-on experience within more of the operational public works side of things through his experience with Edmonton, Regina, and most recently has served as the CAO of Rocky View County out in Alberta. And so although not with us tonight, he was a great addition to providing us with some valuable information as it relates to your project. Next slide, please. The next couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through to how we went about what Tony has explained. And it is really important for us to outline to you that the scope was not limited. We did ensure that we reviewed all 6 departments, touched on all FTEs, as well as spoke to a number of your current workforce as it relates to what they are currently able to do with their time, how they are delivering those services, and what could be some gaps and risks that are being currently unattended to. So we do thank Manoj, Ashley, and the rest of the team who met with us numerous times throughout this engagement to really be able to give us the insights and the base knowledge to form our recommendations. Can I get to the next slide, please? As it was noted, we were engaged and we kicked off our work on August 8th. Our first phase of the Discover was about learning about you. So we did a number of one-on-one meetings here in person, also virtual options when that was not possible, received and analyzed data and documents from each of the departments, and tested our understandings with management throughout this process. We also understood that the benchmarking element of this engagement was important and established which municipalities and how we would be benchmarking for each of the question areas. The overall objective here was to confirm what services the city was currently providing, what are your current staffing levels relative to work that is being sent outsourced, and establish some service standards. We'll speak in more depth on that in a moment. Then we moved into our analyze phase, where we continued to analyze your service standards against the benchmark data that we had, profile the work in terms of who's doing what, how much, and what are the work drivers. These work drivers were critical in understanding what is driving the additional strains on workforces, what has increased within the last chunk of growth and what could increase into the future, whereas what is stable and may not be increasing at the same speed. We applied our experience and our use of experts to establish our recommendations. So what should change as it relates to staffing and improvements, and we'll get into some of those recommendations in the following slides. Now we're finalizing our report phase. So we did provide an initial draft report at the end of September and worked back and forth with management to ensure that we were had everything clear and useful for them to use in that report on a go forward. And here we are presenting to you our findings and our recommendations. So thank you for having us. Next slide, please. So as stated within our statement of work, we are expected to deliver an executive summary, which is the slides you're looking at now and was circulated within your mailing. Our staffing optimization report, so we have delivered that both electronically and in hard copy to Manoj for the use of his team, and ultimately presenting to you today was part of our deliverables as well. Next slide, please.
So before we jump into the benchmarking and the recommendations on staffing, we wanted to make some general observations first, and these are they on this slide. So, and I'll kind of just talk about the first two together, which are the need for service standards and the need for key performance indicators. So I think it's fair to say that, with some exceptions, they're not particularly prevalent within the organisation. So it's best to consider staffing in the light of what needs to be achieved, how well work needs to be delivered and what needs to be executed and done. Without service standards that explain, for example, how long something should take or what the service specification should be, and without measures against that service standard to be able to say, well, if the standard is that we respond within 3 hours, but in reality we want to respond within 7 hours, then without those kinds of frameworks in place, it makes the assessment of staffing a little less quantitative and somewhat more qualitative. So I think our first couple of recommendations and thoughts would be that there is the potential here to improve the use of service standards to help you really understand the performance of the services you're providing, be they internal or external. And they should probably be developed certainly for key customer-facing services. They could be time-based, they're often productivity-based, and that allows you to really understand where you are and how you apply the staff in relation to what it is you're actually trying to achieve. And then the KPIs, which is kind of row number 2, really lets you understand how well you are achieving those service standards and whether you need to think about making adjustments to the staffing. So they're general observations, the first two. The third one, which I think you probably understand quite well, is that you're quite hard to benchmark. So, one component part of this work is the benchmarking. That really leads us to think about how your staffing relates to like organisations. So if we can find organisations as we have that are sort of similar in size, how does your staffing in HR or your staffing in the building organisation compare with others? Is it higher? Is it lower, for example? You're hard to benchmark because of your high growth rate. And so we can benchmark you against organisations, municipalities of a similar size, but I think in Ontario, there aren't, if I recall, there's maybe one that's growing at about 10%, not the 26, 27% that you're hitting. So where you have parts of your organisation that are delivering on the growth agenda, there has to be some allowances made for that in relation to the fantastic growth that you're actually seeing. So it's hard to benchmark you against cities that are quite flat or municipalities that are quite flat. There's limited data available from the MBNC, the Municipal Benchmarking Network, as it exists, and even the FAR data returns that you supply as municipalities up to the province aren't genuinely or generally detailed enough to allow us to benchmark clearly. Now, having said that, what we have been able to do, and you'll see this in a bit more detail in a few minutes, is to really identify, on average, 4 or 5 reasonably comparable municipalities for each facet of the work where we've actually benchmarked you. And we've compared you with median and average and then adjusted in the benchmarks for the growth rates where we think that needs to be adjusted for. No particular surprises from our side on your organisational structures. I mean, you're actually quite small, and so there are no parts of the organisation that look like they're strangely structured, given our experience and in relation to other municipalities that we've worked with. We do think on point number 5, and you'll see this in a minute, that you're quite understaffed in quite a number of places. We'll explain how and where in a few minutes. And clearly, 6, you'll need more staff as you grow, and that's outlined in the report in the mid-term and longer-term scenarios that we've laid out. And then, as you get bigger, you'll need to think a bit more clearly and carefully about how you might go for time-saving tools. So things like automated IVRs, a staff-wide intranet, how you protect your systems using cybersecurity, pre-inspection tools for the building folks, for example, kind of peer-to-peer video calling to save time on those kind of call-outs. And the bigger you get, the more important they'll become. So they're the sort of general observations before we dive into the benchmarking piece and the staffing. So if you could flip to the next slide, please. So just a few words on benchmarking before we kind of take a run through any of the numbers on the slide. So if you haven't clearly understood yet, I mean, I would say benchmarking at best is a direction finder, okay? And when an organization is hard to benchmark, we end up with not an exact science. So we can compare you with the closest municipalities that we can find and make the necessary adjustments, but the benchmark at best gives an indication as to whether we should be growing or shrinking, and broadly what that quantum of change might need to be if we had to come up to your peers. As I mentioned, aspects such as the growth rate here and the transitional student population do make benchmarking quite difficult. Even if we look at Niagara-on-the-Lake, where we have a sort of highly transient holidaying population, kind of almost adds 50% on average to the size of that town, it's still difficult to benchmark you, even with those kinds of organizations filled in. And just because the benchmark here says that we could provide air cover for or potentially justify up to 40 to 50 ads, that doesn't mean you need all of them. What it means is that when we compare you with comparable municipalities, the size that they would have, given the way you operate, would lead us to conclude there's a 40 to 50 range potential FTE headcount addition, just based on the benchmarking. The idea would be that we then take that number and work through what you genuinely do actually need. And typically the benchmarking set that we've used here is a little bit different for each of the services, because the way those organizations, the comparable organizations, operate is a little bit different, and data aren't always available on every aspect of the operation for each municipality. But typically, each of the lines that you can see on the slide in front of you there has about 5 benchmark points behind it. There's typically about 5 municipalities that we've used to compare you against. And then we've taken the median and the average and made some adjustments based on growth rates and other aspects of the operation that we understand to arrive at the range of those numbers on that slide. So that would be the sort of, in a sense, the sort of upper limit to the change that we could see being reasonable. I can give you a couple of examples just to bring some of those larger numbers to life here. So if we were to focus, for example, on the public works organisation, you can see there in PWCS, when we look at the benchmarks, the comparables, and we've used here Grimsby, Pelham, Fort Erie, Lakeshore, Coburg, Middlesex Centre, about 6. Your staffing is at about 35.5, and the average is at about 35.9, the median's at about 31, so you're kind of within limits there. But your growth rate is 26.7%, and the median growth rate's about 6 to 8. So if we make an assumption, which in our experience is usually borne out quite well, that about 20% of that function's effort is factored or is focused on growth, we'd expect to see a considerably larger organisation than you currently have, to the tune of 15 to 20 FTEs up to there, just to cope with the amount of work that needs to be done in relation to managing the growth of the city. Community services, interesting here. So you had about 15 or 16 people focused on parks, for example. You've increased by 1 over the last 5 years. but you've increased the number of parks by about 20% and other asset classes by about 45. So you've upped the actual parks and the infrastructure that needs to be maintained, but you haven't really increased the headcount very much. And that would drive, potential increases of around the 8 to 9 mark on the parks. And then when you add into there that, the increased use of sports fields and park use and resident expectations and so on, and factor in the cemeteries as well, we get to a sort of 8 to 9 there. There are other justifications we could make. I'll just pick, for example, if we look at administration, it's relatively straightforward to benchmark human resource functions. There are standard ratios for what we'd expect to see for human resources staff compared with the actual headcount in the organisation, and you're at about half where we'd expect you to be. We'd expect you to have at least a couple of HR people. I think you only have one currently, based on the benchmark. And so that sort of logic, which isn't in the presentation in detail, because we could spend 3 hours just kind of going through the benchmark, it's all in the report, is kind of how we've given the ranges of what we think would be reasonable additions up to for the entire city if we think they're actually required when we actually complete the analysis. So that's the upper bound, and you can see that the immediate requests there, which I think Sarah's going to take us through now, are in the sort of 24 range. So while there is potential cover for 47 to 56, at least theoretically, outside of the budget, we don't think there's a need for that many in the short term. So even if you were to add 24 to the overall workforce, you'd still benchmark very well against your peers. Sarah?
Thanks. Thank you, Tony. Next slide, please. So as Tony mentioned, both from a benchmarking perspective, which was a significant impact too, we also did understand the service delivery, where service levels were currently exceeding and meeting your citizens' needs, and where you might need to look for additional support in order to continue delivering expedient services. We didn't start with the benchmarking number to build up to the 54 FTE additions list over the 5-year period, but it is in reflection an interesting comparison there. As mentioned, we are completely aware of the budgetary requirements and the growth, smart growth that you do want to ensure, and therefore working with management and assessing what your immediate needs are, the numbers that we recommended at this point of time is 24. So similar to Tony, I am going to go through the positions that are supported in those numbers, focused on the greatest area of growth first being the PWCS. So within Public Works, we have recommended an addition of an associate director, a water wastewater compliance FTE, a utility locate technician, a fleet and equipment supervisor, and 2 maintenance 1 laborers. This here is to support the growth in the infrastructure within the city as it relates to the historical growth and meet those immediate needs to continue providing services and ensuring safe infrastructure for your citizens. The next area of growth recommended is on community services. So we've recommended a total of 8 within community services, which is made up of a cemetery supervisor and cemetery maintenance, which would take on some of the responsibilities, or which would lead the responsibilities in the cemeteries and relieving those responsibilities for parks individuals to focus on those increase in parks. An administrative assistant for facilities and parks. 1 individual to support in the increased bookings in the city's facilities as you start to use your services and grow that more as well. Adding on to the benchmarking that we saw and the growth within your parks and community infrastructure, we are recommending an addition of 4 parks maintenance at levels 1 and 2 to support the delivery of those services. And finally, within this bucket, to support the additional special events, we are recommending a hiring of a special events coordinator. To round out the PWCS, within engineering, we have recommended a project manager to oversee the engineering projects and increase the efficiencies in their delivery, as well as an additional administrative assistant to support the increased workload that has driven as a result of population and department size growth. Moving into the development services, we've identified two immediate needs within the building division, both the building inspector as well as a supervisor of building inspections. With the number of projects and residential growth as well as non-residential growth, ensuring that building inspections are completed on time, compliance is tracked, is prudent for the municipality. Within the planning division, we've recommended immediate growth of one planner, specifically in the development branch, to assist in the increased workloads as the several regulations have recently changed within the planning department, and they are currently navigating those. We'll go up to the top of the list here, and we have recommended an addition of a in-house legal counsel. When we benchmarked you against other organizations, this is something that they are able to handle in-house, and currently a good amount of about $150 per year is being spent on external services, and therefore it would be a redistribution of some of this spending. Our other immediate recommendation within administration is an HR coordinator. As Tony had referenced, we are seeing about almost 60 employees per HR professional, and given your current size, does support growth of an additional HR coordinator, not to mention growth that you're expecting within the future. For our clerk's department, we have recommended two additional positions. The first, we found a gap in your record management, and therefore have recommended a records clerk. And the second position recommended is a customer service representative. The workload and the number of calls and types of calls being fielded by customer service has increased, and therefore felt that this was an important role to ensure continued excellent customer service for the citizens. And finally, within the finance services, this was overall on par with what we were seeing in the benchmarking. We did see a gap in terms of services provided as it relates to procurement services, and therefore have recommended a procurement officer. So that summarizes the 24 of the immediate needs. The 10 midterm needs we have determined based on a combination of benchmarking as well as expected growth within the municipality, whereas the future state needs are more heavily rely on the expected growth rate. So if you continue to grow at the rate in which you do, you would be looking to have additional growth by the end of the 5 years. We have encouraged management to reflect on our findings and ensure that when they are bringing every one of these to council for budget approval, that it is supported with updated facts and circumstances, particularly in those longer term requests. So that concludes our presentation on our the headcount increases. What we did want to do was provide council with a brief walkthrough of one of the departments in terms of what the rest of the report would look like. So as I mentioned, we did cover off all 6 of your departments in depth and provided several pages of analysis and support for each of these recommendations. I have in the following slides the clerk's department that I would like to sort of give you a high-level overview. It is one of the more simple departments, and you know, it is easy for us to walk through. On the flip side, some of our public works departments were quite lengthy sections, and our overall project report, Manoj and team has had to digest over 100 pages for our outcome to support this. So if I can get to the next slide, please. Next slide. So the first 2 slides of our report, or pages of our report per section, is just an overview. So first we give an overview and an understanding of the function and the service provided by that department, provide some commentary on how it operates, sort of some findings that were boiled up and presented to you throughout, as well as a high-level summary of the benchmarking that we would do for each section. Next slide, please. In this section, we'd also cover off, you know, if there was job descriptions provided to us, we would indicate to whether the key performance indicators were being used, and overall summarize what our observations, opportunities, and risks were. I'm definitely trying to provide management with an understanding of each of those in order to help drive the FTE requests as a result of our report. Next slide, please. This was then followed by a strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threat analysis for each of the departments. So similarly to this, you'd have 1 to 2 pages for each of those, and we would summarize where we saw your strengths and your opportunities, and highlight where the weaknesses and threats may be, and in hopes of calling out where improvements may be needed, or the biggest areas of focus, both from an actual investment perspective, but also in terms of what management could be looking at differently within that department. Next slide, please. Then we followed with the baseline understanding of staffing. So we did provide organizational structural charts for each of the departments, as well as the details of our FTE benchmarking. So in this case, you know, we had 2 municipalities that we benchmarked you against. As we mentioned, this is one of the more simple ones, and there were definitely broader and more detailed tables in some of our other sections. Next slide, please. Then we started to explain and support the immediate staffing request. So what was the request? Who would this individual report to? Provided a justification, as well as the risks in which it was assessing to hire this individual, and then helped management understand if there would be any potential challenges in hiring the FTEs. Next slide, please. We then summarized beyond our immediate needs. The tables on before is if we had medium-term or future state needs, we would continue to summarize for each of those columns, and then summarize the total increase recommended within a chart. And final slide, please. And provided the updated organizational charts as required. Thank you. So at that point, that concludes what we wanted to walk you through. If we could go back, or we'll conclude and pull up any slides as required if there are any questions. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Before any questions, I'm going to ask that we put the report on the floor to receive the presentation. Can I get a mover and a seconder to receive the memo and the presentation from Deloitte for information? I have a mover, Councillor Longo, and a seconder, Councillor Decker. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So now the floor is open to any questions to the presentation. Are there any questions to our presenters? to Sarah and Tony. Go ahead, Councillor Longo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll ask a question. There's a lot of talk, thank you very much for the presentation, through you, Mr. Mayor. In your presentation, you talk about baseline and benchmark. So baseline is where we're at, benchmark is where we want to get to. That's my understanding, is that correct?
Mark, is if we take the functions that are within the scope of the study and we look at how other municipalities are doing them on a sort of case-by-case basis, adjusted for size and other factors, that gives us a sense of the resources that other municipalities are deploying to deliver similar services or like services. So often you'll see when you read the report that the benchmarks are, if they're adjusted for the growth rate, they would suggest that you should probably have more resources than you currently hold. So it's not a definitive future state, it's a direction finder. That's the purpose of the benchmark.
Okay, so that was the purpose of my question. So with that response, is it your experience that municipalities that you deal with generally have more employees than the city of Thorold does at this point, based on our size and services offered?
So, as I said, so benchmarking is the direction finder, but when we look at the similar services in other municipalities, ideally of a similar size, but not with the same growth rate, so we have to make an adjustment. When we adjust those basic numbers for as close as we can get to your situation, they have more resources than you do on average, to the tune of 45 to 57, I think, that we showed in the slide. So it's different by different department.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Mayor, so we are chronically understaffed from what I see, according to your study. But most other municipalities aren't in the same situation as us? Or do they share the struggles that we have?
Well, so what we don't know is how well their services are being delivered, because we haven't done that kind of detailed work. We do know broadly how they're staffed. And I don't know how we would qualify the word chronic, but I mean, we would say there are probably 20 immediate ads you need to make based on a blend of the benchmarking, the interviews and conversations that we've had, and our understanding of how things typically work. You could think about pulling forward some of the medium-term suggested ads, maybe not the longer-term ads. But when we look at the evidence that we have, which is the benchmarking, the conversations, the analysis that we've done, and so on, we do conclude that there's probably 20 immediate ads you need to make. It's hard for us to say exactly bang for your buck, because you don't really have the service standards and the KPIs either yet. So ideally that would be, if you had those, we'd be able to better triangulate. But for now, as I explained at the beginning of the conversation, it's more qualitative than quantitative.
I think if I can add,
Yeah, go ahead.
and add on to that service standard perspective, is at the end of the day, you should grow where your services are struggling and where your service standards are not meeting what you expect as it relates to delivering those to the citizens. And therefore, what we have noticed is that you are smaller than similar municipalities, and then adding on adjusting for growth. Yes, it does seem like there's FTEs required. Where we haven't been able to be specific as a result to not having service standards to measure against is exactly where those imminent needs are. So as I mentioned, benchmarking was just one element of how we came up with our recommendations. We did listen to sort of differing service deliveries within, so if there's a range in terms of how the service was delivered, the time, the efficiency of such. We looked at the risks of not being able to deliver the service, and at the end of the day, the municipality has several legal, legislative, and other risks that it does have to manage on a regular basis, and therefore, as an example, the water wastewater compliance edition, there are new regulations coming into that service provider, and that's not a regulation in which anyone would want the city to not be in compliant with. And so benchmarking is one thing to look at. How those services are being demanded and how that's changed based on your growth is another. And then how well are your current staffing levels doing in terms of service delivery in sort of essentially being able to satisfy your citizen. All of those elements were brought together to recommend the immediate increases that we have.
Okay, I appreciate those comments. That makes a lot of sense. So just to wrap up, you're basically saying that some of these new positions are legislated because of changes that we have to stay on top of. And I think the other thing that I've said for the last few years, with the tremendous growth Thorold has, and I think you highlighted in the Parks Division, where we continue to add more citizens, thus more amenities, more parks, and we've kept the frontline staff at the same levels. That's kind of what I think has caught up to us here. I think the struggle is going to be how you implement 20 people in the short term. That's going to be the struggle, but that's not your problem.
Yeah, the old adage that when you spend capital, it comes with operating costs. That's just how the world works. You can't put assets in place and then leave them. Because they'll just dwindle and they won't be well operated. I think the other observation that I neglected to mention a few moments ago was that there's lots of cross working going on because you're a little bit understaffed in certain places. People are supporting each other, which is great. You'd expect them to do that. That dilutes accountability as well within the organisation because everybody's kind of doing everybody else's job. And it also diverts senior management time down into kind of doing work that it should be supervising and expecting others to do. So what happens there is that your long-term planning, your strategy planning, you're thinking about the future, your asset management tends to get pushed into the background for the short-term operational needs to be delivered. And that's a risk that you're storing up for the future if you don't make those additions potentially in certain places.
Thank you, Councillor Longo. I got Councillor DeRose next, and then I got Councillor DeAngelo. Go ahead, Councillor DeRose.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Sarah and Tony. Just listening to you speak and reading up on this. So to validate your findings and recommendations, I would assume you need to have metrics in place so as to measure employee productivity or accountability. So, and you kind of alluded to this. Can you create an accurate organizational review when there are important parameters, metrics that are not in place?
Tony or Sarah?
Yeah, I explained at the start. It would have been better had we had clearly defined service standards and well-defined KPIs, but you don't have them. So in the absence of that, we go to the next level, and we'd always employ the benchmarking. We'd always have the conversations, and we'd always bring the experience to bear. But I can't stand here hand on heart and say to you that you're at level 3 on service 72. Therefore, you need 3 more people. And even if we had the KPIs and the service standards, there would still be some sort of conversation or debate to be had about what's reasonable and rational in the light of that and the benchmarking and where you're heading. So, is it perfect? No. Is the immediate need probably around the 20 mark? Yeah. Could it be 17 or 23? It probably could, but it's not 30 or 10. So probably. So it's not perfectly accurate. This is not a science. You don't feed 6 things in at one end and a sausage comes out at the other with a number 42 attached to it. But certainly had we had service standards and KPIs, it would have made the job easier and less qualitative, I would suggest.
Councillor?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And through you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, Tony or Sarah, whose responsibility on staff is it to create a baseline of metrics and to implement KPIs, key performance indicators? Obviously, someone's going to have to do it. So whose responsibility is it, or should it have been done years ago? I don't understand how we didn't have that in place years ago.
Well, so I think I've been working recently in the municipal space for the last 6 or 7 years, and we see, so it's not that there are no KPIs and no service standards here, but what I would expect to see pretty quickly would be large resource groups, critical services covered with service standards and related KPIs, and KPIs on staffing and productivity as well, where that's appropriate. So, for transactional work, for example, I guess you just need to decide how important it is, and if it is important, you're going to go ahead and you commission that work to be done. Having said that, given the fact that you are understaffed, you've probably spent much of the last few years delivering the sort of pressing operational matters and put KPIs and service standards to the back burner for a while. So you can't do everything. So, is it important? Certainly, yes, for large components of resources and critical services. I don't know in your sort of articles who's decided whose accountability that is, but generally it's a good thing to have. And we did include some examples, I think, in the back of the report for some suggested KPIs for certain aspects.
Thank you. Councillor DeRose.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm just curious because you've done this before, you've worked with other communities. I need to know who is responsible for the KPIs. There has to be someone in a chain of command that's responsible to create this criteria. So in your experience, who usually is the staff member that deals with this or creates this?
So when we've done this kind of work before, and we've suggested that KPIs need to be developed, it usually finds its way to the CAO, Chief Administrative Officer, and that person decides if it's an appropriate priority or not, commissions the work either internally or using external resources. I don't know what the structure of your organisation is as it pertains to KPIs and who's generally accountable, but it generally starts at the top of the shop.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Last question. Is this the fulsome report? Is this the whole report?
Councillor DeRose, did you want to add something before I go to his next question?
Yeah, I have one more question, Mr. Mayor.
No.
Can you hear me?
I wanted
Sarah
to
wanted to
add
add something to your last
Oh,
question.
I'm
wanted to
sorry,
add-
Sarah. Yes, add something to that answer. I'm
Thank you,
sorry.
Councillor. And I mean, just the only thing to say is as much as
Thank you.
it may reside at the top, it is not a singular activity or a single person's activity. This is when as Tony sort of alluded to, is certain services would have priority as it relates to understanding this type of performance metric for those services, and those service providers, both from the senior management all the way through to understanding how those services were delivered. It is quite an invasive and sort of time-consuming process in which to do this, and I would sort of reiterate Tony's comment as well, in that when you come down to, do I deliver the service well, or do I work on the performance management side? We do know where the priorities go, and I think that is something we see time and time again. You are not the only municipality of the size of this growth who does not have key performance service standards or key performance indicators.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor DeRose.
Thank you, Sarah. Mr. Mayor, you have one more question.
Yeah, go
And
ahead.
it's to Sarah and Tony. Is this the whole report? Because I received a 10-page report in my eScribe, and then I know you added some more information tonight in the PowerPoint. So is the 10 pages I have the full report?
The 10 pages you have is the executive summary report of the report, providing the summarized recommendations. We have provided management with the full report, which is up over 100 pages.
And that'll be forthcoming.
Okay,
The full report has been received tonight, and I'm sure that we'll be distributing it to council. We'll get the full report.
yeah, I'm just wondering, Mr. Mayor, why we didn't have a copy of it, but that's fine. But thank you, Sarah and Tony, for answering those questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor D'Angelo up next, and then Councillor O'Hare.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a few questions and a few comments. One of my questions is, when you were doing benchmarking, you used Pelham and Niagara on the Lake as the two municipalities. Why would you not use Port Colborne as opposed to Niagara on the Lake? Port Colborne is more similar to Thorold, and it has the similar attributes that Niagara on the Lake does. So I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, so it depends on the on each of the functions. So and I can look it up, but that was the example that was shown. There are other examples of benchmarking where we've used 6 or 8 different organizations. Part of it is just being able to obtain the data as well as to pick reason comparables. So we can't always access all of the data from all of the municipalities.
Okay, yeah, Port Colborne's more of a similar stature. It's got a canal going through its city.
Yeah.
It's got spread out parks. Niagara-on-the-Lake is not very similar to Thorold. It's got a greater tourism population, more agricultural. So in terms of comparison, and barring growth is different. But
Yeah.
I'd rather see some of the comparators to Port Colborne.
Yeah.
You know, they've developed some large events, and so that was one question. The other
They're all
question-
in the report, councillor. So for each of the different sections on benchmarking, there are different municipalities that we've used, and what we've taken care to do where we can, it's not always perfect, is to take averages and medians rather than to take sort of individual, just single municipalities, 'cause it tends to kind of even out some of the statistical error in the numbers when we do that.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah, just keep in mind, I haven't seen the full report. It hasn't
Understood,
come
yeah,
through.
yeah.
All I've seen is what you presented today.
Understood, yeah.
And so that's
Okay.
why I'm asking some more
Not a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And I look forward to getting the report. If I could get a hard copy, that would be greatly appreciated for myself. I'm not sure if the rest of council wants that. I do have some other questions again, one of the key things I'm concerned about is the service standards and the KPIs. Without them, it's hard to measure how you're achieving. So to me, that's one of the critical things. And you made an excellent comment earlier. You talked about the fact that we don't have any long-term planning here at this point in time because our strategic plan actually ended this year and we haven't even started the new one. So we're going into a budget next year, and I feel bad for staff. They don't really have this council's sort of stamp of where we want to move forward. So we're going to be dealing with issue by issue as we have council meetings. So your comment was very valuable at the time, so that's something. And I know later, Mr. Chair, I'm going to be referring this report also to our strategic plan, and also mention again, we got to get going on it. It's the year's ended, our plans expired. It was last council's plan. This council hasn't put a stamp on where we want to go and what we want to do, and with our staff there to give them good, proper direction. If not, we're going to be dealing with issues council by council meeting.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor D'Angela, we are selecting the consultant. The report will be presented to council on the 12th of December. So after that, the consultant will be retained and will start the process. Later this year, they will do the direct action and consultation early in the new year. So the council will and the community will have their say in the process at that time. So yes, the current strategic plan ends December 2023, and the consultant selection process is currently going on, and the report will be presented to council on December 12th.
If I could ask a further question, when do you anticipate the final strategic plan being in place? Prior to the 2024 budget being deliberated or after?
It will be done concurrently, I guess, when we are debating for our budget. The data and everything will be provided to the consultant after we retain them, getting council approval on December 12th. And they will start the process early in January, and it's going to be first quarter before they finalize everything. But we will, council will have interviews with the consultants so they can provide their input early on in the process as well.
So the sooner the better, because it impacts our.
Okay, so let's stick to the presentation here, please.
Not a problem. I have some additional questions here. When you put this report together, did you look at some of the contract positions we have in our organization? Because one of the positions you called for was in community services, I believe, was an individual that was planning events in our community. So we have that as a contract position. So is that included in your numbers, or should that come off the anticipated amount? Because we have that position in place. What council has decided to do is ramp that up because we didn't have the events to make that a full-time position, but we're slowly putting the events in place and creating new ones. So some of the recommendation here of the 24 people, we already have them in place. So it's like someone's going to read that we need 24, but we do have a contract position for that. And one of the other ones, so I'll let you answer that one first. Did you look at our contract positions and how they fill in some of the gaps that you're forming here?
So the baseline was supported by your full-time employees, and so it did not include any contract positions that would not extend past the end of fiscal 2023.
Okay, so I think that should be included in our report that comes forward, because that also affects the numbers. So that was one question. The other one too is, and I know some of these positions, I don't want to get too much into the report because I know it's going to be shifted, but like, I use the example of legal because I've heard this many times. Like, we spent $150,000 on legal, so we're going to get a lawyer here. So that means we'll spend 0 legal fees outside of that. That individual will take care of all our legal needs? Is that what's being anticipated?
The inclusion of the in-house legal counsel does address some risks that we've identified as it relates to the accessibility and the types of legal. Our analysis wouldn't preclude additional services being retained as it relates to the specialties required for each demand. We do want to make sure that we're recommending a structure that equips management with sort of the best access to information to protect the town from any legal risks.
I'm just always concerned when I hear adding these positions and say it's gonna, you're gonna save on the one end. I've seen this on the police board, I've seen it at the region, it doesn't always work that way. You end up getting an in-house lawyer, but then you still go out and get the legal services that you had originally, so there's actually no cost savings with that measure.
And there has been a lot where smaller municipalities are sharing a legal counsel.
Yeah, and then that's also confirmed with the HR, because we're looking at 2 HR people. You know, HR services are provided by the region. There's an area to tap in when you need those. So again, unfortunately, we're a small municipality and you can't just jump to the numbers. You have to work your way through it, and sometimes contracted positions meet our needs more than a full-time employee because the demand isn't there for a full-time employee. But as it ramps up, then you move into that. I use the example of the individual regarding community events. By the end of our term, I'm sure there'll be enough work there for that person to be full-time, but at this present time, it's just being ramped up. So those are some of the concerns. And then I'll leave it at that, Mr. Mayor, at this
Okay.
point in time, but I would, like I said, when it comes to making a recommendation, I'd also like this report to go to the strategic planning session.
We'll make sure that you get to make that motion at the correct time. Councillor O'Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our presenters, thank you so much for coming in. It was a great presentation. A lot of valuable information that's going to prove useful over the next coming months as we prepare a budget. I want to return again to the number one topic, which is KPIs and service standards. And it's a pretty simple question. Maybe it has a more complicated answer, maybe not, but the question is, of the 6 departments that you analyzed and studied and looked into, are there any of those specific departments that we should address first regarding putting forth the design of KPIs and service standards?
I mean, as it pertains to the topic of conversation tonight, I would certainly pick the large labour groups where we can first, particularly where the work's reasonably repeatable. It lends itself to easier measurement when we do that. So I would start there from an efficiency and productivity point of view. So aside from that, the fire department has measures in place. It kind of has 2 under the codes. So there's sort of KPIs in there already, and you'll probably refresh those after the fire review that you're going to do. So I would genuinely start there. Then I'd think about sort of health and safety aspects. So I'd want to make sure that the parks are well maintained, that the snow's well removed, and the roads are clear, and those kinds of things. And the roads are well maintained too. So I mean, you can sort of think through, depending on where your priorities as a council lie, as to where you might want to start first. But if it was really pertaining to the conversation tonight, I'd be looking at the large labour groups and making sure that's under control to begin with. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Councillor Sentence.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, thank you very much for the presentation. Very helpful. It just, when we're talking about KPIs, and there are just boots on the ground type of things, when we get phone calls all the time, and they've increased over time, you know, grass cutting, permits, getting an answer at City Hall, bylaw calls. This isn't necessarily staff's ignoring these things, is they need people to do these jobs, and I think we've known that for a few years. So I know it has to be mindful to budget, and maybe it's a phased-in approach, but this really helps us underline what we kind of already knew, I think, and I look forward to trying to make our services better for everybody. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Seeing none, I want to thank you for the presentation, Sarah and Tony. It's much appreciated. You brought the copies of the report, and we'll make sure they get distributed accordingly. And thank you for your work, and now we have work to do.
Thank you.
And that work will, I'm sure, as council will start at budget, and then council will have that opportunity to debate those and decide what positions we're going to fill, and the number based on staff recommendation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Okay, so the memo, CAO 14-2023, organizational review. Can I get a mover and a seconder? I got a mover, Councillor D'Angelo, a seconder, Councillor O'Hare. Is there any discussion? Go ahead, Councillor
No
D'Angelo.
discussion. I just want to, I know it's being referred to budget, but I also want to refer to strategic planning.
That's good. Can we add that as well? That it's
And then
get
also, just so I have a clear understanding, when it's referred to budget, will the CAO or the appropriate department head come back with a business case for each on this list? Just so there's.
Well, the budget will be coming out, and I'll ask Manoj and our Director of Finance if they
Well,
want to comment.
I need, my question is, will there be a business case for each of the positions that have been identified here, so council can deliberate those?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, certainly, Councillor, and that's the intent that whenever we are presenting any position forward to council, we are presenting with them like a brief summary, and that also the supporting document from this report that will be distributed to you, which Deloitte has presented. And also the thing is, as in the past, I know that Deloitte has recommended 24 positions that we have to hire immediately. But I understand from senior staff perspective, we are, as always, we are going to look at which positions we can prioritize it and put it in the budget. And also we have to be respectful, and always, as always, we want to make sure that the increase for tax levy is reasonable what we presented to council. So that element will always be taken into consideration when we present the budget to you. And second thing that you mentioned about, and I mentioned about not only budget, but we will incorporate some of the stuff as we move forward in our strategic planning process as well.
Okay.
Okay, just, yeah, because on that point with our strategic plan, that may change some of these numbers and where the allocations. So I appreciate staff will review these, come back with their list and priority of what they would like to see put into the budget. That would be very helpful, which you just.
Did you want to comment on that, Maria? No, because that'll all be included in the budget package when it comes.
So maybe, Mr. Mayor, Councillor, what we'll do is, with each position that we will be requesting from in our base budget, and some positions, let's say there are 24 positions that has been recommended by Deloitte. What we'll do is we'll prioritize among staff ourselves what positions we think keeping the levy, tax levy in a reasonable level, but we will also have description of the business cases as well, and also the recommendation that came from Deloitte and the benchmarking and all that they talked about it, so that it gives enough information to council why are we asking for it, and then and the justification and the reason which Deloitte report has presented, that will go along with it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, it's important to see what cost reduction measures are in there, because it talks about, like in the clerk's department, it talks about licensing and other, so there may be increases in fees to offset that individual that comes in there. So I'd like to see that as part of the business case.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and that's what we are doing. Let's say, for example, in a planning department as well, we are asking for, let's say the recommendation is to have another planner. And I know some of that is because it is legislated, we need to do that, but also we're reviewing our planning fees. So the development should pay for itself, and then we are adjusting our fees so that the impact on the levy is reduced to that. Thank you.
Okay. And so we've captured that, and that will also, the report will also go. Okay? Is there any further discussion? I got a mover and a seconder. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Bylaws. Can I get a mover and a seconder for Bill 175, 2023? I got Counselor Sentence and Counselor Ditavitas. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Adjournment. There being no further business, this meeting is hereby adjourned at 7:34 PM. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for